Ernst Theodor Wilhelm Hoffmann, ETA Hoffmann, was a romantic polymath. He had a restless desire to create. In fact, he produced significant work as an author of fiction, a government legal counselor, a music critic, a caricaturist, and a composer. He changed his own middle name, Wilhelm, to Amadeus, to honor Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, hence ETA Hoffmann. But the Tales of Hoffmann are not by Hoffmann. The Tales of Hoffmann is an opera by Jacques Offenbach based on three of Hoffmann's stories, The Sandman, Councillor Krespel, and The Lost Reflection. Tchaikovsky's ballet The Nutcracker uses Alexander Dumas' adaptation of Hoffmann's The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. In other words, Hoffmann not only produced in many, many areas, he was influential in many, many areas, most of them, that is the artistic ones, full of imagination. He is what we would call a romantic polymath. The terms romance and romantic have 6 related meanings that bear on the study of the arts. They are the Romance languages, romantic content, romantic attitudes and themes, the Romantic period in art, the Romantic poets, and the Romantic structure in art. Let me explain each of these in turn, because, as we will see, imaginative works are always, in some sense, romantic. First, the Romance languages are those descended from Latin, the language of Rome, hence French, Spanish, Italian, Romansh, Romany, Portuguese, and so on. But Northern Europeans viewed Rome as exotic, mysterious, flamboyant. So the Romance languages are not merely a set of languages, but languages that convey a certain affinity to whatever exoticism, mystery, and flamboyance may mean. The second, romantic content, tells us something about that. Romantic content is erotically charged, or in some other way heightened over the merely natural. This use of the term romantic, like the term fantastic, is often opposed to the term realistic. It was a romantic idea, it was a realistic idea. There are also romantic attitudes and themes. These stress the importance of the ego and strong emotion. The Romantic period in art, at least for English speakers, conventionally is said to begin with the publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge's quite personal volume called Lyrical Ballads in 1798. What Coleridge and Wordsworth said they were about was recording the real language of the people. Anyone who reads their poems knows that people don't really speak that way, but they speak much more that way than was the language of the preceding period, the balanced cadences of the neoclassic period. The canonical Romantic poets in English are, of course, Wordsworth and Coleridge, and also Shelley, Keats, and Byron. In the Germanic cultures, the key Romantic writers are Goethe and Hoffmann. Then there is the Romantic structure in art, particularly in literature. Romantic structure indicates a work in which the ideals that are posited, sometimes only by implication, at the very beginning, are fulfilled by the end. Now, let me try to exemplify this. Going all the way back, for example, to the classic tale Daphnis and Chloe by Longus. In the first chapter, an infant boy is found abandoned on an island, and he has with him a little golden scepter. In the second chapter, a little infant girl is found, abandoned on the other side of the island, and around her waist is a little golden chain. They will be found by shepherds, they will be raised, but we already know, because of the golden tokens with which they're found and the parallelism of their discovery, that Daphnis and Chloe are going to turn out to be of royal birth. They will come together, and ultimately they will marry. Of course, along the way, their true identities have to be discovered. When they fall in love, the course of romance may not be smooth. In fact, pirates kidnap Chloe, and Daphnis has to go and retrieve her. But in the last chapter of the book, the two of them together go off into the cave of Hymen, the god of marriage. In other words, they come together. From the very beginning, we can see that the ideal for these characters is that they will be joined in some high estate. And the end is simply the ratification that this original understanding of the ideal was true. When I use the word ideal in this sense, I don't necessarily mean ideally good. I mean ideal in the same way that Plato uses the word ideal, that is, something perfect. So we have, for example, in American literature, a work like The Jungle, in which at the beginning we see that the character, the poor downtrodden immigrant, is likely to have his condition go from bad to worse. And indeed, as we go through the book, his condition goes from bad to worse, to worse, to worse, to worse. At the end of that book, suddenly the author, Upton Sinclair, has the main character enlightened, and he says, yes, workers of the world unite. Chicago, that's where it's set, will be ours. And in theory, it's a happy ending. In fact, most readers feel that the ending is simply tacked on, that the real story is the story of the degradation of Yorgos, the main character, by the packing industry, in the meat packing industry in which he works. We can have ideals that are bad. We can have ideals that are good. The point is that they are, in some sense, ideal. Realistic works of literature do not necessarily fulfill opening ideals. We don't know at the beginning of The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway how the story will end. But we know at the beginning of Daphnis and Chloe that they will come together. Most works, in fact, are romantic. Despite the critical preference for realism since the late 19th century, in fact, most of the works in the world are imaginative and often romantic because people are satisfied by having their predictions confirmed. So we have 6 uses for the term romantic. Romantic languages, romantic content, romantic attitudes and themes, oh, that ego, the romantic period in art, when that ego is justified, validated, and expressed in the language of the people, particularly by the romantic poets, fulfilling romantic structures in art. Indeed, most of the imaginative works that we would discuss will in fact be seen to be in one way or another romantic. Hoffmann was a romantic polymath. Art is a central subject in Hoffmann's own stories. The title character of Councillor Krespel is odd, self-indulgent, yet it turns out fantastically successful as his own architect. Notice that Councillor Krespel is, as Hoffmann was, a legal counselor. He is able to work as an architect with a plan, just as Hoffmann was a caricaturist. In this story, Councillor Krespel builds his house according to a plan in his own head. The angles are crazy. The layout is odd. And yet, when he's done, the home is beautiful. He indulges himself in music. The backstory of Councillor Krespel is that he had an extraordinary love, a singer named Angela, but she died. And all he has left is his beautiful daughter, Antonia. Antonia, however, is frail, and it becomes clear that if Krespel were to allow his daughter to sing at the fullness of her vigor, she would risk killing herself. Antonia falls in love with a man known as B, with a dash after it, and Councillor Krespel knows that she, Antonia, is tempted always to make beautiful music with B. Not only metaphorically, but literally. B plays the piano. One evening when B is in the house, Councillor Krespel leaves the room, but he hears them singing. An appalling fear was combined with a rapture he, Krespel, had never heard and had never before experienced. At the moment of hearing his daughter singing, instead of stopping her, perhaps he listens, perhaps he swoons. The next thing the narrative tells us is that he awakens from an unconscious state, goes into the parlor, and finds his daughter has died. Councillor Krespel indulges his own passion, his romance for music, to retrieve the romance for Angela that exists only in the body of Antonia, with fatal consequences for his daughter. Art is powerful in the fantasies of E.T.A. Hoffmann. One of Hoffmann's most extraordinary stories is called the Doubles, Die Doppelganger in German. This story is full of characters who are, in fact, doubles of each other. In literary terms, a doppelganger is one of a set of characters who together map out a single psychological space. In Hoffmann's tale, The Doubles, we have two young men who are doubles for each other, although they don't know it. One of the young men is in love with a woman named Natalie, but he does not know that she exists. He is a painter and has been painting her from his imagination. The other young man actually knows Natalie, and he is in love with her. They compete for Natalie's love. It turns out that they are themselves the children of two men, a prince first and a count, Graf, who themselves were doubles in running the princedom. They were married to women who themselves were doubles, and all of these were friends of each other. They had, these two couples, two sons. The sons were switched at birth and raised by one of their counselors. He kept them safe because of political upheaval, and later they come to fall in love with Natalie, his daughter. The story has even more doubles in it. There are, for example, the innkeepers of the Silver Lamb and the Golden Ram inns, which are on opposite sides of the same street. What is amazing about this story is that the way in which it is told, we ourselves, as readers, find that we cannot follow the story. That is, we are confused as to which character is which, not because we can't write it down and make a map of them, but because their physical characteristics, their desires, are so interchangeable in some ways that it's almost as if we see one when we think we're seeing the other. At one point, one of the characters is shot and wounded and develops a wound that now makes him physically identical to the character he had previously been a double for, but physically different. When the painter sees the real Natalie, he realizes that this has been the woman of his dreams all along. And so they're both vying for the same woman. In grammatical terms, technical terms, the word ambiguity refers to a semantic structure which is susceptible to more than one interpretation, equally valid. So, for example, flying planes can be dangerous. That sentence has two meanings. Piloting aircraft can be dangerous. Watch out, there can be planes coming by. Flying planes are dangerous. If the two different meanings are from the same realm, then ambiguity simply creates indecision. But if the two different meanings come from fundamentally different realms, if they are in worlds that have basically different ground rules, then ambiguity creates the fantastic. I walked down the street and turned into a drugstore. In one realm, I simply made a left. In the other realm, poof, I became an aspirin dispenser. Those two realms, the ground rules of one world are like ours, the ground rules of the other, magic applies. When ambiguity makes us shift instantly from one set of ground rules to another, we have the fantastic. More generally, the fantastic is the affect, that is, the psychological response, created by the quick, complete reversal of the fundamental assumptions held by a reader at a given moment as the reader proceeds. Or more technically, the fantastic is the affect generated by the diametric, diachronic reversal of the ground rules of the narrative world. Diametric means all the way across, as in the diameter of a circle. Diachronic means through time. That's as opposed to synchronic, all at one time. I'll repeat. The fantastic is the affect generated by the diametric, diachronic reversal of the ground rules of the narrative world. In a fairy tale, that reversal happens with the opening conventional formula. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful golden-haired princess. We know we're in a fantastic world. In fact, one in which animals can talk. And if we encounter them talking, we don't have that as a shock. There's no new reversal. But if I were to say, once upon a time, there was a beautiful golden-haired princess, and she fell deeply in love with an accountant named Harry Mendelbaum, that would be more fantastic yet, because in the world that begins once upon a time, there are no accountants. There are only wealthy kings and poor beggars. The ground rules have made a diametric, diachronic reversal. Note that the fantastic arises not out of something that does not exist. There really are accountants in the world. It arises in the process of reading. Grimm's fairy tales are fantastic, but they are not true fantasies. But a work like The Doubles by Hoffmann, in fact, is a true fantasy because its use of ambiguity, our inability to be able to know which character is which at any given moment, makes us feel this constant off-centering that characterizes the fantastic. In Ritter Gluck, we see that this reversal occurs at all four levels of a narrative that can conserve, that is, hang on to, diachronic, happening through time, information. Those four levels that conserve diachronic information are style, thematic development, character development, and plot. There's a place at the beginning of Ritter Gluck where our viewpoint character is sitting outside in a plaza in Berlin. It's the autumn. He is watching the people walk by, and he sees dandies, which represents, I guess, something about how people dress, solid citizens with their wives and adored children. I'm not sure you can tell how adored they are by the way they are dressed, all dressed in their Sunday best, clergymen, maybe or maybe not identifiable by dress, Jewesses, certainly not identifiable by dress, junior barristers, their junior status how understood, prostitutes, who are supposedly blending in with everyone else, professors, milliners, dancers, officers, etc. That is, the very catalog of passers-by itself keeps asking us to redefine how we know what these people are. The ground rules at the level of style are sort of changing. I walked down the street and turned into a drugstore. In fact, Ritter Gluck listens, in Ritter Gluck, the viewpoint character listens as a band starts to play, and he suddenly hears an octave interval and screams out, "Ah, an execrable octave." The man next to him understands and says, "Ah, you find that terrible as well." It turns out this man claims to be a great composer named Ritter Gluck. Now, this particular story was published years after Gluck really died, as Hoffmann's readers would have known. As you read the story, you realize that nobody else ever sees Ritter Gluck but the viewpoint character. The viewpoint character goes back to Gluck's, or whoever it is, his house, and enters his back room through dark and parting curtains. It's almost as if it were a regression. He is told that Ritter Gluck had a vision in which he went off to a celestial realm and heard the euphon, this ideal sound, and then came back to Earth and tried to compose music accordingly, and that was a violation, and so he has been condemned to stay on Earth forever. He wants to play his own music, and he takes the books of the music off his shelf and asks the viewpoint character to turn the pages. Miraculously, the pages are blank, but Ritter Gluck is able to play the music perfectly. Since the viewpoint character knows Gluck's work, he turns the pages at the appropriate point. It is only at the end, when they have finished a composition, that the ghost, or whoever he is, says to the viewpoint character, "I am Ritter Gluck." The way the story is told, we don't know whether that character who speaks is an inspired madman who just turns out to be a terrific pianist and has memorized the works of Gluck, or is a ghost, or is a projection of the insanity of our own viewpoint character who is driven crazy by the mere sound of an octave interval. The fact that the story does not resolve itself, that through its structural ambiguities it goes on with us never knowing what the fundamental ground rules ultimately shall be, helps us understand why this work, unlike fairy tales, is not merely fantastic, but a true fantasy. Hoffmann said that his own favorite among his tales was The Golden Pot, and he subtitled it a modern fairy tale. What makes it modern, of course, is that it goes well beyond regular fairy tales. It gives us, for instance, a character who drops ink on the very pages that he is supposedly copying, and hence changes their meanings. He falls in love with a creature who may be one of three green snakes, or may be a denizen of Atlantis. He works for an archivist who probably is a librarian, but may be a wizard from Atlantis sent to Earth. He is thwarted by an old woman who sells apples, good old apples from the Garden of Eden, or may be a witch, or may be the old enemy from Atlantis of the archivist who may not in fact be a librarian, etc., etc. The way the story is narrated, we see through that viewpoint character, through that young man who's the copyist, and we can't tell sometimes what we're seeing or not. And so we feel the very fantasy that Hoffmann is explaining happens. And at the end, that viewpoint character is said to be in the inkwell. And we can't tell whether he has simply decided to live out his life wanting that girl, that snake, that figure from myth, and psychologically he will spend his time writing it out, or he is really trapped as a homunculus inside a crystal inkwell, or he has now gone back to Atlantis with her and exists in our world only in the story that Hoffmann has written. The story is a true fantasy. One of Hoffmann's most important fantasies, one that gives us great important insight into the general field, is one called The Sandman. The Sandman is the story of a boy whose father dabbled in alchemy. One day, one of his father's fellow dabblers comes along and is vile at dinner. He touches the boy's food, making it unclean from the boy's viewpoint. The boy hides in a cupboard in the father's workroom, where after dinner the father and the visitor repair to do alchemical experiments, and as it happens, there's an explosion. With that explosion, the father is killed. Years later, the boy meets an eyeglass salesman, and that eyeglass salesman causes him to swoon into some magic vision of wanting the eyes. I need the eyes, the eyeglass salesman says in the boy's dream, or now the young man's dream. All of this is set within the story of the relationship of the viewpoint character to a woman named Clara. Clarity, clear vision. And he, the viewpoint character, is complaining of the difficulty of his relations with the eyeglass salesman in a letter he sends to his friend Lothar. But in fact, he sends it to Clara by mistake. Clara explains that this was perhaps an error, that he really wanted her to see it, what we would now call a Freudian slip. But of course, Freud had not begun writing then. Freud was not alive then. Freud, however, takes this story in which the man becomes ever more invested in his fantasy and uses it as the main example for his own most important work on fantasy. In the story, the man falls in love with a robot named Olympia, but no one else understands Olympia to be real, only this fellow. Eventually, however, having projected life into it, he is driven crazy and whirls around on the top of a bell tower and plunges to his death. Freud sees this story as exemplifying the following. First, that art, the creation of Olympia, the writing of poems to Olympia by the viewpoint character, art is created by trauma. In other words, we have something go wrong with us, and we need to compensate. Art arises from the unconscious. We don't know we're doing it. Art is compensatory, and art is repetitive. Art is repetitive. These 4 points, traumatic, unconscious, compensatory, repetitive, form the basis of Freud's theory, which he puts forth in a 1919 essay called The Uncanny. Hoffmann believed in depth psychology. That is, he believed in the notion that we have an underlying unconscious or subconscious mind that is more powerful than the mind of which we are conscious. But he didn't particularly believe in Freudian theory. The Sandman does support a tripartite notion of the psyche. A superego, the father figure in the Sandman, say, who wants us to behave certain ways. The id, or the libido, more specifically, that is the id, the underlying energies to act and consume and have desire, or specifically libidinous energies, sexual activity and desire, which need to come together and be conjoined, coordinated for there to be a healthy ego. This tripartite view of the psyche, superego, ego, libido, fits perfectly with the Sandman. But in the doubles, we have the ego in a quadripartite map, the map that Freud's erstwhile student, Carl Gustav Jung, had, where the ego can have a double who is a better version of the self, and a dark double who perverts the possibilities of the self. If the ego is male, then the female toward which he strives is the anima, like Natalie in the doubles, and there is a dark woman who can be the perversion of those ideals, which you can never be. A male can't be a female, as is the witch who keeps him away from Natalie. If the ego is female, then the striving is for a male animus and a dark man. In fact, the union of these pieces in the tripartite manner or the quadripartite manner of Freud or Jung is what gives psychological strength. Art is what allows that in Hoffmann. Art is a matter of inspiration. We are taken over by it, as in Ritter Gluck, as in Councillor Krespel. When you write a poem, you can survive it. But if need be, as in the Doubles, you must renounce. And neither character winds up with Natalie. They're better off. Art could help us from fantasy, but not overcome the dangers of sex. For Hoffmann, and for many of the world's great imaginative artists, the achievement of art depends upon both embracing and disciplining the fantastic.